The $500 fine arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, and I stood there in my driveway staring at it like it might spontaneously combust if I looked hard enough. I'm York Lawson, and I've lived in Meadowbrook Estates in suburban Denver, Colorado, for 3 years now. I bought my house here thinking it would be a quiet place to settle down after my divorce, somewhere I could focus on my work as a software consultant and maybe have some peace. The neighborhood seemed nice enough when I moved in cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, the whole suburban dream package. What I didn't fully appreciate at the time was the iron grip the homeowners association held over every single aspect of our lives. The fine was for disturbing the peace during prohibited hours, because I'd run my snowblower at 6 in the morning after the biggest snowstorm Denver had seen in 5 years. 18 inches of snow had dumped on us overnight, and I had a critical meeting with a client in Boulder at 8. If I didn't clear my driveway, I wasn't getting out, and if I didn't get out, I was losing a contract worth $50,000. But apparently, according to the HOA's noise ordinance, a rule I'd never even heard of until that moment, no motorized landscaping equipment could be operated before 8 on weekdays. The fact that a snowblower isn't landscaping equipment and that the entire neighborhood was buried under 1.5 feet of snow didn't seem to matter. I walked back inside, tossed the fine on my kitchen counter, and called the HOA office. A chipper recorded message informed me that office hours were 9 to 4 Monday through Friday. I glanced at my watch. It was 7:30. I'd have to deal with this later. The meeting in Boulder went well, at least. I secured the contract, which meant steady work for the next 6 months. On the drive back home, I noticed something interesting. The main roads were plowed, obviously, but many of the side streets in Meadowbrook Estates were still covered in packed snow and ice. The neighborhood had 3 primary routes that connected to the main highway Willow Drive, Oakmont Street, and the private road called Heritage Lane that ran along the back of the development. Most residents used these routes to get to work, school, or pretty much anywhere. When I pulled into my neighborhood, I saw my neighbor, Tom, struggling to get his sedan through the slush on Willow Drive. His wheels spun uselessly as he tried to navigate the mess. I'd cleared my own driveway that morning, but the street in front of my house, which happened to be right at the intersection where Willow Drive met Oakmont Street, was still buried. That's when the idea started forming. I parked in my garage and went inside, looking at the fine again. $500 for the crime of trying to get to work. I pulled out my HOA handbook, a tome I'd glanced at exactly once when I moved in, and started reading. Really reading. The rules were insane. Pages and pages of regulations about everything from the exact shade of white you could paint your mailbox to the specific species of flowers allowed in front yard gardens. But there, buried in Section 12, subsection D, I found the noise ordinance. And right below it, in Section 13, I found something interesting. Homeowners are responsible for snow and ice removal from their own driveways and walkways. The HOA will coordinate snow removal from common areas and streets within 72 hours of snowfall. 72 hours. 3 days. That was a long time to leave streets impassable, especially when most people needed to get to work the morning after a storm. But here's the thing: my property line extended further than most people realized. When I bought the house, the survey had shown that I actually owned a strip of land that included part of what everyone assumed was the public street. It was a quirk of how the development had been plotted decades ago. The previous owner had never made an issue of it, and neither had I. I just always cleared it when I cleared my driveway because it seemed like the neighborly thing to do. That strip of land I owned. It was right at the junction of Willow Drive and Oakmont Street, the intersection almost everyone in the neighborhood had to pass through to get to the highway. I spent the rest of that afternoon rereading my property deed and verifying the survey markers. Sure enough, I owned approximately 40 feet of what looked like public road. Technically, it was a private easement that I'd been allowing the neighborhood to use. The next morning, I called the HOA office as soon as it opened. A woman answered with a saccharine voice that immediately set my teeth on edge. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. This is Brenda speaking. How may I help you? Hi, this is York Lawson at 342 Willow Drive. I received a fine yesterday that I'd like to discuss. One moment, please. I heard typing, then a slight pause. Ah, yes, Mr. Lawson, the noise violation. The fine was issued because you operated a snowblower at 6:03 in the morning. Our noise ordinance clearly states that no motorized equipment can be used before 8 on weekdays. I'm aware of what the fine says, I replied, keeping my voice level. I'm calling because I had to get to work, and the snow made my driveway impassable. I cleared it as early as I could to make an 8 o'clock meeting. That's unfortunate, Mr. Lawson, but the rules apply to everyone. If we made exceptions, the whole system would fall apart. I took a deep breath. The whole neighborhood was buried in snow. You're telling me that work emergencies don't matter. The noise ordinance exists to ensure all residents can enjoy peaceful mornings. One person's work emergency doesn't trump everyone else's right to sleep. And who exactly complained? I asked. I'm not at liberty to share that information. But the complaint was filed and our security patrol confirmed the violation. The fine stands. You can pay online or mail a check to our office. Payment is due within 30 days. What if I want to appeal? Another pause. You can submit a written appeal to the board. They meet once a month. The next meeting is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And in the meantime, I'm supposed to just pay a $500 fine. The fine is due regardless of whether you appeal, Mr. Lawson. If the board rules in your favor, you'll receive a refund. I felt my jaw clench. Who's on the board? Our board president is Patricia Hammond, vice president is Robert Chen, and the third member is Sandra Williams. Patricia Hammond. I knew that name. She lived in one of the larger houses on Heritage Lane, drove a white Lexus SUV, and had a reputation for being exceptionally particular about neighborhood rules. I'd seen her at exactly one HOA meeting when I first moved in, where she'd spent 45 minutes arguing about whether a resident should be allowed to plant purple petunias instead of white ones. Fine, I said. I'll submit an appeal, but I'm not paying the fine until this is resolved. That's your choice, Mr. Lawson, but be advised that unpaid fines accrue interest at 5% per month. She hung up before I could respond. I sat at my kitchen table, fuming. $500, 5% monthly interest, for running a snowblower so I could get to work. That afternoon, I drafted my appeal letter, citing the emergency nature of the situation, the excessive amount of snow, and the fact that I had a legitimate work obligation. I printed it, signed it, and drove it over to the HOA office myself, getting a stamped receipt that confirmed delivery. Then I went home and did nothing. Specifically, I did nothing about the snow still covering the 40-foot section of road I owned at the intersection of Willow Drive and Oakmont Street. By Thursday, 3 days after the storm, the HOA finally sent plows through the neighborhood. They cleared most of the streets, piling snow in neat berms along the edges. But when the plow reached my intersection, it pushed snow right up to the edge of the cleared sections and stopped. The 40-foot section I owned remained untouched. because technically, it wasn't their responsibility. It was mine, and I chose not to clear it. The snow had been driven over repeatedly by this point, packed down into a slick, rutted mess of ice and frozen slush. It was passable, barely, if you had a vehicle with good clearance and decent tires. But it was slow going, and more than a little treacherous. I watched from my living room window that evening as car after car crept through the intersection, wheels spinning, vehicles sliding slightly as they navigated the obstacle. Most made it through, but it added several minutes to everyone's commute as they had to slow to a crawl, carefully pick their way across, then accelerate again once they hit the cleared road on the other side. Friday morning, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Patricia Hammond standing on my porch, her blonde hair in a perfect bob, wearing a cream-colored wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice dripping with false friendliness. "I'm Patricia Hammond, HOA board president." "Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I said, not inviting her in. "What can I do for you?" She glanced past me into my house, clearly expecting an invitation that wasn't coming. After an awkward moment, she refocused on me. "I wanted to discuss the snow situation at your intersection. As I'm sure you've noticed, there's still a section that hasn't been cleared, and it's causing some difficulty for residents trying to navigate the area." "I have noticed that," I agreed pleasantly. "It's unfortunate." "Yes. Well, the HOA completed our snow removal yesterday, but that section appears to have been missed. I wanted to make sure it gets addressed as soon as possible." "That section wasn't missed," I said. "The HOA didn't clear it because it's not HOA property. It's mine." Her expression flickered with confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" "The property survey clearly shows that I own that section of land. It's been that way since before I bought the house. I've always cleared it in the past as a courtesy, but it's not actually a public street. It's a private easement on my property." Patricia's smile tightened. "I'm sure there must be some mistake. That's part of the neighborhood street system." "No mistake. I have the survey and the deed. Would you like to see them?" "That won't be necessary," she said quickly. "But surely you understand that section needs to be cleared. It's a safety hazard." "I agree it would be better if it were cleared," I said. "Unfortunately, I'm not able to clear it right now." "Why not? You have a snowblower. We all heard it the other morning." "True," I said. "But according to your noise ordinance, I can't run it before 8 on weekdays. And I leave for work at 7. By the time I get home in the evening, it's too dark and cold to do a good job of it." "Weekend would work, but the next storm is supposed to roll in tomorrow night, so there's not much point in clearing it just to have it get buried again." Her face was reddening now. "Mr. Lawson, this is ridiculous. You're deliberately creating a hazard." "I'm not creating anything," I said calmly. "Nature created the hazard. I'm simply declining to remedy it on my own property, which is my right as a homeowner." "The HOA can compel you to maintain your property," she snapped. "True," I agreed. "Per the handbook, you can fine me if I fail to maintain visible property standards. But that section of road isn't visible from the street as an individual property. It looks like part of the road system. And snow removal isn't specifically mentioned in the maintenance requirements, except for driveways and walkways, which I've kept clear." I could see her mentally scrolling through the rulebook, looking for a way to counter me. She came up empty. "This is absurd," she finally said. "You're going to cause accidents, injuries. The HOA could be liable." "The HOA isn't liable for what happens on my private property," I pointed out. "I am. And since it's my property, I have no obligation to allow anyone to use it. Technically, every car that crosses that section is trespassing." Her eyes went wide. "You wouldn't dare. Wouldn't dare what? Enforce my property rights. I'm not saying I will, I'm just noting that I legally could. Patricia stood there for a long moment, her jaw working like she was chewing rocks. This is because of the fine, isn't it? The fine that I'm appealing. The one for having the audacity to clear my driveway so I could get to work. That fine. The rules exist for a reason, Mr. Lawson. I'm sure they do. Just as property rights exist for a reason. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. I closed the door before she could respond. That weekend, the predicted storm hit. Another 12 inches of snow blanketed the neighborhood on Saturday night. I woke up Sunday morning, looked out at the fresh powder covering everything, and made myself a leisurely breakfast. The snowblower sat in my garage, untouched. Monday morning was chaos. I watched from my window with my coffee as the neighborhood woke up to find their carefully plowed streets buried again. And this time, because the HOA's 72-hour response window had reset, no plows would come until at least Wednesday. But the real problem was my intersection. The previous layer of packed snow and ice was now buried under a fresh foot of powder. The whole 40-foot section was essentially impassable for anything except high-clearance trucks and subs. Regular sedans got stuck. I counted 3 vehicles that had to be pushed through by neighbors who'd come out to help. The commute crawl started at 6:30 and didn't ease up until after 9. Instead of taking 30 seconds to pass through the intersection, cars were taking 5 to 10 minutes to navigate it, creating a massive backup that stretched down both Willow Drive and Oakmont Street. By Monday evening, my phone was ringing constantly. I didn't recognize most of the numbers, so I didn't answer. The voicemails were furious neighbors demanding I clear the street. Several threatened to sue me. One particularly irate message informed me that his wife had missed a critical medical appointment because she'd gotten stuck in the intersection. Tuesday morning brought more of the same. I worked from home that day, watching the drama unfold from my living room. A woman in a Honda Civic got stuck right in the middle of the intersection, her wheels spinning futilely. She sat there for 20 minutes, blocking both directions, until enough neighbors came out to push her through. The line of waiting cars stretched back so far that vehicles were backed up onto Heritage Lane. That's when I saw Patricia Hammond's white Lexus trying to navigate through. She lived on Heritage Lane and normally used it to reach the highway, but with cars backed up onto that route, she'd apparently decided to try the Willow-Oakmont path, despite the conditions. I watched with a certain grim satisfaction as her luxury SUV hit the snow-packed intersection and immediately lost traction. Her wheels spun, sending up plumes of powder and ice. She tried to back up and get a running start, but that only dug her in deeper. Within minutes, her Lexus was sitting at an angle, rear wheels buried, completely blocking the intersection. My phone rang. This time I recognized the HOA office number. I answered. "Mr. Lawson, this is Brenda from the HOA office. I need you to come outside and help push Mrs. Hammond's vehicle. She's stuck in the intersection." "I'm working," I said. "I can't just drop everything." "Mr. Lawson, she's blocking the entire road. People need to get through." "That does sound problematic. Have you called a tow truck?" "A tow truck will take hours in these conditions." "We need your help now." "I'm sorry, but I'm in the middle of a work call. I can't help right now." I hung up. The call I was supposedly on didn't actually start for another 20 minutes, but they didn't need to know that. I watched through the window as Patricia sat in her Lexus, clearly on her phone, her face getting redder and redder. Other neighbors were gathering, some trying to push, others just standing around looking frustrated. After about 30 minutes of futile pushing and increasingly angry gestures, a neighbor with a pickup truck managed to pull her free using a tow strap. Patricia's Lexus limped out of the intersection, its rear bumper slightly dented from the extraction, and disappeared down the road. 10 minutes later, someone started pounding on my door. I opened it to find Patricia standing there again, this time without the fake friendliness. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her coat had snow on it, and her face was flushed with anger. "You watched me get stuck and did nothing," she said without preamble. "I was working," I said calmly. "I'm sorry you had trouble. The intersection is pretty rough right now. This is your fault. All of this is your fault. Actually, I think you could argue it's the weather's fault. Or possibly the HOA's fault for having such a slow response time to snow removal. You know exactly what you're doing," she hissed. "You're punishing the entire neighborhood because of one little fine." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm simply declining to maintain a section of private property that I'm under no obligation to maintain. If the neighborhood is experiencing inconvenience as a result, perhaps the HOA should consider being more reasonable about emergencies. That fine was legitimate. You broke the rules. And you're welcome to enforce that fine, just as I'm welcome to enforce my property rights. Now, if there's nothing else, I really do need to get back to work. The board will hear about this," she shouted as I closed the door. "You're going to regret this." Wednesday brought the HOA snowplows through the neighborhood again. They cleared the streets, piling snow into berms, and once again stopped right at the edge of my 40-foot section. By this point, the intersection was a disaster. With multiple layers of snow, ice, packed slush, and ruts from spinning tires, it looked more like an off-road course than a suburban street. The plow driver actually got out of his truck and walked up to my door. He was an older guy, weathered face, looking tired and frustrated. "Hey, buddy," he said when I answered. "Any chance you could clear this section? It's making my job really difficult and people are complaining." "I wish I could," I said, injecting genuine regret into my voice. "But HOA rules won't let me run my snowblower early enough to do it before work, and by the time I get home it's too dark and cold. Plus, another storm is supposed to hit this weekend." He nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "HOA gave you grief about something, huh?" $500 fine for clearing my driveway so I could get to work." He let out a low whistle. "That's rough. Well, I can't say I blame you. Good luck with it." He walked back to his plow and drove off. That evening, I received a certified letter from the HOA. It informed me that I was being fined $200 for failure to maintain property standards, creating a safety hazard. The letter cited a provision in the HOA rules about keeping property safe and accessible. I read it carefully, then drafted a response. I pointed out that the section in question was a private easement that I'd voluntarily allowed the neighborhood to use, but that I was under no obligation to maintain it for public use. I noted that if the HOA believed it should be maintained as a public street, they were welcome to purchase it from me at fair market value. I suggested $20,000, given that it was the linchpin of the neighborhood's entire traffic flow. I sent the letter via certified mail and waited. The weekend storm hit as predicted. This time, 16 inches of snow fell over 2 days, starting Friday night and ending Sunday afternoon. By Monday morning, my intersection was completely impassable. The accumulated snow and ice was now over 2 feet deep in places, with massive ruts and frozen ridges making it look like a miniature mountain range. Cars couldn't get through at all. Trucks struggled. The entire neighborhood's commute route was effectively blocked. People had to use an alternate route that added 20 minutes to the drive, going all the way around the neighborhood to access the highway from a different direction. My phone exploded with messages. The voicemails were no longer just angry, they were desperate. People had missed work. Kids had missed school. One woman left a tearful message saying she'd been late to her father's surgery because of the blocked route. I felt a twinge of guilt at that one, but I pushed it down. I hadn't created this situation. The HOA had. They decided that their arbitrary rules were more important than common sense or emergency situations. Now they were experiencing the consequences of rigid, unreasonable governance. Tuesday afternoon, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mr. Lawson, this is Robert Chen, Vice President of the HOA Board. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Robert Chen. I'd never met him, but he had a reputation for being more reasonable than Patricia. He was an engineer at Lockheed Martin, lived with his wife and 2 kids, and generally kept a low profile. "I have a few minutes," I said cautiously. "I wanted to discuss the situation with the intersection. I understand there's been some friction between you and Patricia." "That's one way to put it. Look, I'll be straight with you. I reviewed your property survey, and you're absolutely right that section is your property. The HOA has no legal standing to force you to maintain it. I appreciate you acknowledging that. However," he continued, "you can see the problem this is causing for the neighborhood. People can't get to work. Emergency vehicles are having trouble accessing this area. Is there some way we can work this out?" I offered a solution in my letter, I said. "The HOA can purchase the easement from me and take responsibility for maintaining it." $20,000, he sighed. "That's not in our budget, especially not for what amounts to 40 feet of roadway." "Then I guess the HOA should have thought about that before fining me for trying to get to work during an emergency." "About that," Robert said, "I want to apologize. I wasn't aware of the fine until Patricia mentioned it yesterday. I reviewed the situation, and honestly, I think it was excessive. You were clearly dealing with an emergency situation, and the noise ordinance was written with things like lawn mowers and leaf blowers in mind, not snow removal during a major storm." "That's nice to hear," I said, "but the fine still stands, doesn't it? Along with a second fine for not clearing this intersection. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow evening. I'm going to recommend that both fines be rescinded. Patricia won't like it, but Sandra will probably vote with me, and that's a majority." "That's generous," I said. "But it doesn't address the larger issue." "Which is?" "The HOA's complete inflexibility and refusal to consider context or circumstances. What happens the next time there's a major storm? Am I supposed to just miss work because the HOA thinks rules are more important than reality?" Robert was quiet for a moment. "What if we amended the noise ordinance to include an exception for emergency snow removal?" "That would be a start," I said, "but I'd want it in writing before I clear the intersection." "Fair enough. Come to the board meeting tomorrow. 7 p.m. at the community center. We'll put it to a vote, and if it passes, will you clear the intersection?" I thought about it. "If both fines are rescinded, and the noise ordinance is amended to include a reasonable exception for emergency snow removal, yes, I'll clear it immediately." "Deal," Robert said. "See you tomorrow." I hung up, feeling like maybe there was a light at the end of this tunnel, but I wasn't counting on anything until I saw it in writing. Wednesday evening, I drove to the community center for the board meeting. The parking lot was packed. Apparently word had gotten out, and a lot of neighbors wanted to see how this played out. I walked into the meeting room to find about 50 people crammed into a space designed for 30. Patricia sat at a table in the front with Robert and Sandra Williams, a retired teacher who'd always seemed nice enough on the few occasions I'd met her. Patricia's face went stony when she saw me walk in. She stood up and called the meeting to order. "We have several items on tonight's agenda," she began, but I understand there's an urgent matter that needs to be addressed first. Robert? Robert stood up, looking nervous. Thank you, Patricia. As everyone is aware, we've been experiencing significant traffic issues at the intersection of Willow Drive and Oakmont Street due to snow accumulation. After reviewing the property records, the board has confirmed that this section is actually private property owned by Mr. York Lawson. A murmur ran through the crowd. Apparently not everyone had known this detail. Mr. Lawson has been maintaining this section voluntarily for years, Robert continued, but he recently stopped due to a dispute with the HOA. I've spoken with Mr. Lawson, and we've reached a potential resolution. I'm proposing that the board take the following actions. He pulled out a printed document and read from it. First, rescind the $500 fine issued to Mr. Lawson for noise violation, acknowledging that emergency snow removal during a major storm should not fall under the noise ordinance. Second, rescind the $200 fine issued for property maintenance, acknowledging that Mr. Lawson has no obligation to maintain a private easement for public use. Third, amend the noise ordinance to include an exception for emergency snow removal during or immediately after major weather events. In exchange, Mr. Lawson has agreed to clear the intersection and maintain it as he has in the past. Sandra nodded. I think that's eminently reasonable. I move to approve all three measures. I second, Robert said immediately. Patricia's face had gone from red to nearly purple. Absolutely not. This is outrageous. Mr. Lawson broke clearly stated rules and is now holding the entire neighborhood hostage. We cannot reward this behavior. We're not rewarding anything, Sandra said firmly. We're acknowledging that we made a mistake and correcting it. The noise ordinance should never have been applied to emergency snow removal, and Robert is right that we have no legal authority to force Mr. Lawson to maintain that intersection. If we give in to him, it sets a terrible precedent, Patricia insisted. Every homeowner with a complaint will think they can just ignore the rules. No, Robert said. Every homeowner will know that the rules can be modified when they don't make sense and that the board is willing to admit mistakes. That's called good governance, Patricia. The crowd murmured approval. I saw several people nodding. Patricia looked around, clearly realizing she was losing. Fine. Let's vote. All in favor of Robert's proposal, Robert and Sandra raised their hands. Opposed, Patricia raised her hand alone. The motion carries, Robert said. He looked at me. Mr. Lawson, we'll have the amended ordinance drafted and the fines officially rescinded within 48 hours. Will you clear the intersection? I stood up. I'll clear it first thing tomorrow morning. Thank you for being reasonable. The crowd actually applauded. Patricia gathered her papers and stormed out of the room. I left the meeting feeling vindicated but also relieved. The whole situation had been exhausting, and I was glad it was over. Or so I thought. Thursday morning I was up at 5:30. I'd checked the weather, and it was supposed to be clear and relatively warm by Denver winter standards, anyway, which meant it was a perfect day to clear the intersection. I fired up my snowblower at 6 a.m., well before the 8 o'clock limit, and spent the next hour clearing the entire 40-foot section. I didn't just clear it, I did a thorough job. I removed all the packed snow and ice down to the pavement, spreading salt and sand for traction. By the time I was done, that intersection was cleaner than it had been all winter. Neighbors started emerging for their morning commutes around 7. Several stopped to thank me. One guy actually got out of his car and shook my hand. A woman I'd never met brought me a thermos of hot coffee. It felt good to be appreciated instead of vilified. I showered, changed, and headed to my home office to start work. Around 9, I got a call from Robert. Just wanted to thank you, he said. The intersection looks great, and I've already gotten positive feedback from several residents. Happy to help, I said. As long as the HOA is reasonable, I'm happy to keep things running smoothly. About that, Robert said, I wanted to give you a heads up. Patricia submitted her resignation from the board this morning. Really? Yeah. I don't think she appreciated being outvoted in front of the whole neighborhood. Between you and me, I'm not sorry to see her go. She's been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for years, and I think a lot of people are tired of it. Who's going to replace her? We'll hold elections next month. Anyone can run. You should consider it, actually. The neighborhood could use more people who think practically instead of just following rules blindly. I laughed. I'll think about it. Thanks for letting me know. I hung up feeling like maybe this whole mess had actually resulted in positive change. The tyrannical HOA president was gone, the absurd rules were being modified, and the neighborhood seemed to appreciate my stance. But I should have known it wouldn't end that cleanly. Friday afternoon, I got a certified letter from an attorney representing Patricia Hammond personally, not the HOA. The letter informed me that Mrs. Hammond was suing me for intentional infliction of emotional distress, creating a public nuisance and reckless endangerment related to my failure to clear the intersection. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Even after everything had been resolved, even after the board had rescinded the fines and amended the rules, Patricia was still coming after me. I called the attorney listed on the letterhead, a guy named Marcus Brennan with a Denver law firm. His secretary put me through after a brief hold. Mr. Lawson, he said in a smooth, practiced voice, I assume you're calling about Mrs. Hammond's lawsuit. You assume correctly, I said. I'm trying to understand what possible basis she has for this suit. The HOA board agreed that I had no obligation to maintain that intersection. Mrs. Hammond is suing in her personal capacity, Brennan explained. She claims that your deliberate failure to maintain a previously maintained portion of roadway created dangerous conditions that directly resulted in property damage to her vehicle and significant emotional distress. Property damage. You mean the tiny dent in her bumper from when she got stuck and had to be pulled out? The repair estimate is $3,000. $3,000 for a bumper dent. It's a Lexus, he said, as if that explained everything. Additionally, Mrs. Hammond claims that the stress of dealing with this situation has caused her to suffer anxiety and insomnia requiring medical treatment. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. This is ridiculous. She started this whole thing by fining me for clearing my driveway. That may be, Brennan said, but that doesn't give you the right to deliberately create a hazardous condition. You admitted that you chose not to clear the intersection, knowing it would cause problems. I chose not to maintain my own private property. That's not illegal. We'll let a court decide that. Mrs. Hammond is serious about this, Mr. Lawson. I'd suggest you retain counsel. He hung up. I sat there for a long moment, processing. Then I called my own attorney, a guy named Steve Winters who'd handled my divorce and a few contract disputes related to my consulting business. I explained the situation. Steve listened, asked a few clarifying questions, then laughed. She doesn't have a case. This is completely frivolous. You're sure? Positive. You own the property. You have no legal obligation to maintain it for public use. Even if you deliberately chose not to maintain it, that's your right as a property owner. Her property damage was caused by her decision to drive across your property during hazardous conditions, which is arguably trespassing. An emotional distress. Please. No judge is going to award damages because she got stressed out over a neighborhood dispute she started. So what do I do? I'll draft a response. We'll move to dismiss for failure to state a claim. This will probably never even make it to trial. But if it does, you'll win easily, and we might be able to recover legal fees. Might. Colorado doesn't always award fees in civil cases, even if the suit is frivolous. But given how obviously baseless this is, we'd have a good shot. I thanked him and hung up. Part of me wanted to just ignore the whole thing, but Steve had been clear I needed to respond, or Patricia could win by default. Over the next few weeks, Steve filed our response and motion to dismiss. Patricia's attorney responded with increasingly absurd arguments, trying to claim that my pattern of behavior demonstrated malicious intent, and that the neighborhood had a reasonable expectation that I would continue maintaining the intersection. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for late February. In the meantime, winter continued. We got several more snowstorms, but smaller ones just a few inches at a time. I cleared my driveway and the intersection each time, usually around 7 in the morning when it was light enough to see but early enough that I could finish before work. Several neighbors had started helping, bringing out their own shovels to clear the edges while I ran the snowblower. The sense of community actually improved. People who'd lived next to each other for years but never talked started chatting while clearing snow. Someone organized a neighborhood coffee morning. Robert Chen mentioned at one point that HOA complaints had dropped by nearly 60% since Patricia resigned. The court hearing arrived on a cold Thursday morning. I met Steve at the courthouse in downtown Denver. Patricia was there with Marcus Brennan, looking prim and furious in a navy suit. The judge was a middle-aged woman named Elizabeth Torres, who had a reputation for no-nonsense practicality. She reviewed the filings, asked a few questions, then delivered her ruling. "Mr. Brennan," she said, looking at Patricia's attorney, "I've read your complaint and your responses to the motion to dismiss, and I'm struggling to find any legal theory that supports your client's case. Mr. Lawson owns the property in question. He has no statutory duty to maintain it for public use. Your client chose to drive across his property during hazardous conditions and sustained minor vehicle damage as a result. That's not Mr. Lawson's responsibility." "Your Honor," Brennan said, standing up, "Mr. Lawson had maintained that property for years, creating a reasonable expectation of continued maintenance. His sudden withdrawal of that maintenance, motivated by spite, directly caused dangerous conditions. Property owners are allowed to change how they maintain their property, Mr. Brennan. And even if Mr. Lawson's motivation was, as you say, spite, that doesn't create liability. People are allowed to be spiteful with their own property as long as they're not violating any laws or regulations. But the emotional distress is not actionable," Judge Torres interrupted. "Intentional infliction of emotional distress requires conduct that is extreme and outrageous beyond all bounds of decency. Declining to shovel snow on private property doesn't remotely meet that standard. Mr. Lawson's motion to dismiss is granted. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice." Patricia stood up. "This is outrageous. He deliberately created a dangerous situation, Mrs. Hammond," Judge Torres said firmly. "If you had concerns about the road conditions, you should have chosen an alternate route. You chose to drive across private property during a snowstorm. That was your decision, and the consequences are yours to bear. This case is dismissed, and Mrs. Hammond, I'd strongly advise against filing any more frivolous lawsuits. The next judge might not be as patient." We filed out of the courtroom. Steve was grinning. "That went as well as it possibly could have. Now about recovering your legal fees." "Do it," I said. "She needs to learn that she can't just sue people for spite." Steve filed a motion for fees. Patricia's attorney opposed it, but Judge Torres granted it, awarding me $8,000 to cover my legal costs. Patricia had to pay her own attorney fees on top of that. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Marcus Brennan had charged her nearly $15,000 for the case, meaning the whole fiasco had cost Patricia more than $20,000 and accomplished nothing except making her look vindictive and foolish. Life in Meadowbrook Estates returned to something resembling normal. March brought warmer weather and the end of snow season. The intersection I'd fought so hard over turned into just another piece of pavement, unremarkable and functional. In April, the HOA held board elections as promised. Robert Chen stayed on as president. Sandra Williams remained as well. And to my surprise, several neighbors approached me about running for the third seat. I thought about it seriously. Part of me wanted nothing to do with HOA governance. The whole experience had been exhausting. But another part recognized that the only way to prevent future Patricia Hammonds from making everyone's lives miserable was to get involved and push for reasonable policies. I threw my hat in the ring. There were 3 candidates total. Me, a woman named Jennifer Wright who'd lived in the neighborhood for 10 years, and a guy named Paul Henderson who seemed nice enough but was clearly Patricia Hammond's handpicked successor, spouting the same rigid talking points about maintaining standards and enforcing rules. The election was held at the monthly HOA meeting. I gave a short speech about practical governance, common sense, and flexibility when circumstances warranted it. Jennifer talked about improving neighborhood amenities. Paul gave a 15-minute lecture about the importance of rules and how the neighborhood had become too lax under Robert's leadership. The vote wasn't even close. I won with 63%, Jennifer came in second, and Paul got less than 10%. Robert welcomed me to the board with a handshake and a grin. "Congratulations," he said. "Ready to help run this asylum, as long as we can keep it sane," I said. Over the next few months, the board made several changes. We revised the noise ordinance to include explicit exceptions for emergency situations. We reduced several excessive fines to more reasonable levels. We implemented a common-sense waiver process for homeowners dealing with extenuating circumstances. We also passed a resolution officially acknowledging that the intersection I'd fought over was private property and establishing a formal agreement. I would maintain it, and the HOA would provide salt, sand, and reimbursement for equipment maintenance. It wasn't the $20,000 I'd jokingly asked for, but it was fair recognition of my contribution. Patricia Hammond moved out of Meadowbrook Estates in June. I heard she'd bought a house in a different neighborhood with an even stricter HOA. I wished them luck with her. The following winter brought plenty of snow, including one storm that dropped 22 inches in a single night. I cleared my driveway and the intersection at 6:30 in the morning, and nobody complained. Several neighbors came out to help. Someone brought donuts. It was actually pleasant. One evening in late January, almost exactly a year after the whole mess started, I was sitting in my living room when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Robert Chen standing there with a bottle of wine. "Hey," he said. "Got a minute?" "Sure, come in." We sat in my living room and he poured us each a glass. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for everything last year, for standing up to Patricia, for joining the board, for helping make this neighborhood function like an actual community instead of a dictatorship." "I didn't do it alone," I said. "You were the one who called the emergency meeting and actually listened to reason." "Yeah, but you were the one who had the guts to draw a line in the snow, literally." He laughed. "That intersection thing was brilliant, by the way. Petty, sure, but brilliant. It made everyone realize how ridiculous things had gotten." "I wasn't trying to be brilliant," I admitted. I was just pissed off. Best motivation sometimes, Robert said. You know what the ironic thing is? Patricia genuinely thought she was helping the neighborhood. She really believed that strict enforcement of every rule, no matter how minor, was the only way to maintain property values and quality of life. She couldn't see that she was making everyone miserable. Some people are so focused on rules they forget about the people the rules are supposed to serve, I said. We finished the bottle of wine, talking about neighborhood stuff, work, life. It was nice. A year ago, Robert had been just another neighbor I barely knew. Now he was a friend. After he left, I stood at my window looking out at the intersection. Under the streetlight, I could see the patch of pavement that had been the center of so much conflict. Snow covered it now, a light dusting from the evening's flurries, but it wasn't the impassable barrier it had been a year ago. It was just a street, serving its purpose, causing no drama. My snowblower sat in the garage, ready for the next storm. The HOA handbook on my shelf had sticky notes marking all the revised sections. My neighbor Tom had borrowed my shovel earlier and returned it with a case of beer as thanks. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to be: people working together, helping each other out, being reasonable when problems arose. It had taken a dramatic standoff and a petty act of malicious compliance to get here, but we'd arrived. I thought about the $500 fine that had started everything, about Patricia's fury when I'd refused to back down, about the court hearing where a judge had essentially told her to grow up and stop filing frivolous lawsuits. It had been stressful, exhausting, and at times infuriating. But it had also been necessary. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to break it a little more first, to force everyone to see how absurd things have become. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Wright, the other board member. Storm warning for tomorrow night. 12 to 18 inches. You free for morning snow clearing duty, I typed back. I'll fire up the snowblower at 7. Bring coffee. Deal. I set my phone down and smiled. A year ago, a text like that would have been followed by threats and fines. Now, it was followed by offers of coffee and community cooperation. The snow would come. It always did in Colorado winters, and when it did, I'd clear my driveway and that 40-foot section of intersection that had caused so much trouble. Not because an HOA threatened me with fines, but because it was the right thing to do, and because my neighbors appreciated it instead of taking it for granted. That intersection had become a symbol of everything wrong with rigid, inflexible governance. Now it was a symbol of what was possible when people chose reason over rules, cooperation over control. I walked to my kitchen and made a cup of tea, thinking about the whole saga. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd end up on the HOA board after a battle over snow removal, I'd have thought they were crazy. But here I was, and honestly, I was glad. The neighborhood was better for what had happened. Patricia was gone, replaced by people who actually cared about community over control. The rules had been revised to make sense. People were friendlier, more connected, more willing to help each other out, and me. I'd learned something important. Sometimes standing your ground, even in a way that seems petty or vindictive, is the right thing to do. Not because revenge feels good, though I won't lie. Watching Patricia's face during that court hearing had been satisfying, but because it forces change that needs to happen. The snow came the next night, 16 inches of heavy, wet powder. I was up at 6:45, pulling on my warmest coat and boots. The snowblower started on the first pull, and I spent 90 minutes clearing everything: my driveway, my walkway, and that symbolic 40-foot stretch of intersection. Jennifer showed up around 8 with coffee as promised. Tom came out with his shovel to help with the edges. Robert drove by on his way to work and honked, giving me a thumbs up through his window. By 9, the intersection was clear, the neighborhood traffic was flowing normally, and I was standing in my garage putting the snowblower away when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, memories of angry neighbors flooding back, but curiosity won. "Hello, Mr. Lawson. This is Cheryl Martinez from the Denver Post. I'm doing a story about HOA disputes and how residents handle them. Your name came up in my research. Do you have time for an interview?" I hesitated. "What kind of story?" "Oh, nothing negative. Actually, I'm looking at cases where homeowners successfully pushed back against unreasonable HOA policies. I found the court records from your case with Patricia Hammond, and I'm fascinated by the intersection snow removal angle. It's a perfect example of creative civil disobedience." I thought about it. A year ago, I might have said no, wanting to just put the whole thing behind me. But now, with the perspective of time and the positive changes that had resulted, maybe sharing the story could help other people dealing with similar situations. "Sure," I said. "I can talk. When works for you." We set up an interview for the following week. The article ran 2 weeks later, and it was actually good fare, balanced, highlighting both the absurdity of the original fine and the effectiveness of my response. It ended with a quote from Robert Chen about how the neighborhood had changed for the better. The article got picked up by a few other outlets. I did a couple of radio interviews. Someone even asked if I wanted to write a book about HOA conflicts, which I politely declined. I'd lived through it once. I didn't need to relive it in manuscript form, but the attention did one useful thing. It made other HOAs think twice about rigid rule enforcement. I got emails from people across Colorado and beyond, thanking me for standing up to HOA tyranny and asking for advice on their own situations. I wasn't a crusader or an activist. I was just a guy who'd gotten fed up with an unreasonable fine and decided to push back. But apparently that resonated with a lot of people who felt powerless against their own HOA boards. Spring came, melting the last of the winter snow. The intersection returned to being just another piece of pavement, notable only for the neat job I'd done clearing it all season. My relationship with the neighborhood had fundamentally changed. People knew my name now, stopped to chat, invited me to backyard barbecues. In May, the HOA held its annual meeting. Robert presented a report on the past year, highlighting reduced complaints, improved neighbor relationships, and better community engagement. The meeting that had once been dominated by Patricia's lectures about rule violations now featured actual discussions about playground improvements and neighborhood watch programs. During the open comment period, Tom stood up. "I just want to say thanks to York for everything he did last year. I know it was controversial at the time, but honestly, this neighborhood is so much better now. We actually talk to each other. We help each other out. That's what a community should be." There was applause. Genuine applause, not the polite golf clapping that had characterized previous meetings. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and pride. After the meeting, an older woman I'd seen around but never met approached me. "Mr. Lawson, I'm Dorothy Green. I live over on Heritage Lane." "Nice to meet you," I said, shaking her hand. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "I was one of the people who left you an angry voicemail last year when the intersection was blocked. I said some pretty harsh things." "It's okay," I said. "I understood the frustration." "No, it's not okay. I should have directed that anger at the HOA, not at you. You were just trying to make a point, and honestly, you were right to do it. Patricia ran this place like a tyrant for years, and nobody had the guts to stand up to her. You did. So thank you." We talked for a few minutes, and I learned that Dorothy was a retired librarian who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. She'd watched the HOA transform from a helpful community organization into what she called a petty bureaucracy run by wannabe dictators. "You gave us the push we needed to take it back," she said. "Don't underestimate what you did." Over the summer, life settled into a comfortable routine. I worked, served on the HOA board once a month, maintained my property and the intersection, and actually enjoyed living in Meadowbrook Estates for the first time since I'd moved in. In August, I got a letter. Not certified, not threatening, just a regular envelope with a handwritten address. Inside was a short note on expensive stationery. "Mr. Lawson, I owe you an apology. My behavior last year was inappropriate and caused harm to you and the neighborhood. I was so focused on enforcing rules that I lost sight of why those rules existed in the first place. I hope you and your neighbors are well. Sincerely, Patricia Hammond." I read it twice, surprised. It took guts to write that letter, especially after everything that had happened. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what I'd say, but I kept it. Maybe people could change. Maybe even Patricia had learned something from the whole mess. Fall came, bringing cooler weather and the first hints of the approaching winter. At the September HOA meeting, Robert suggested we review our snow removal policies before the first storm hit. "I think we should increase our budget for snow clearing," he said. "Get plows out faster, maybe within 24 hours instead of 72. We should also establish a neighborhood volunteer list for people who need help clearing walkways, elderly residents, people with disabilities, that kind of thing." The proposals passed unanimously. We also created a weather emergency protocol that explicitly suspended certain rules during major storms, including the noise ordinance. In October, a young couple with 2 small kids moved into the house across the street from me, the one that had been empty since spring. Their names were Marcus and Lisa Donovan, and they were friendly, energetic, and excited about the neighborhood. "We heard this is a great place to raise kids," Lisa told me when I brought over a welcome basket. "Good schools, friendly neighbors, active community." "It is," I said. "Now anyway." There was a time when I might not have said that, but things have really improved. "We actually read about this neighborhood," Marcus said. "There was an article about some HOA dispute over snow removal. We were impressed that the community came together and made changes." "That's the kind of place we wanted to live," I laughed. "Well, I'm glad some good came out of that whole mess. Let me know if you need anything." As I walked back to my house, I thought about how strange it was that my petty act of rebellion had become a selling point for the neighborhood. People wanted to live in a place where the HOA was reasonable, where residents could push back against absurd rules, where community mattered more than rigid enforcement. November brought the first snow of the season, just a light dusting. I cleared my driveway and the intersection without thinking about it. No drama, no stress. Marcus came out with his new snowblower and helped, and we chatted about his job in IT and my consulting work. December arrived with the first major storm, 13 inches overnight. I was out at 7 in the morning, clearing snow. Jennifer showed up with coffee and muffins. Tom helped with his shovel. Lisa from across the street brought her kids out, and they helped by building a snowman in my front yard while we worked. By 8:30, the intersection was clear, the neighborhood was functional, and I was standing in my garage warming my hands around a cup of coffee, watching my neighbors head off to work with waves and thank yous. This was what I'd fought for, I realized. Not the right to be petty or vindictive, but the right to live in a community that valued people over paperwork, common sense over compliance, cooperation over control. The snowblower sat in my garage, well-maintained and ready for the next storm. The intersection outside was clear and safe. The neighborhood was thriving, and I was part of making that happen, not in spite of my rebellion against the HOA, but because of it. Sometimes the only way to fix what's broken is to break it first. Sometimes standing your ground, even in ways that seem petty, creates the space for necessary change. And sometimes, just sometimes, a simple act of refusing to clear 40 feet of snow can transform an entire community. The winter stretched ahead, full of storms yet to come, snow yet to fall, driveways and intersections yet to clear. But I was ready. We all were. Not because an HOA demanded it, but because we'd chosen it together, as neighbors who actually gave a damn about each other. That made all the difference.